There is a specific sound that survivors described for the rest of their lives. Not the roar of water, not the crack of timber, something older than both of those. A low, resonant hum that came up through the ground first, through the soles of their shoes, through the floorboards of their kitchens, before the sound reached their ears at all. A vibration that had no name in 1889 because nothing like it had ever happened to an American city before. By the time they heard it, it was already too late. The 31st of May, 1889, Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Population, approximately 30,000 people. At exactly 3:10 inches the afternoon, the South Fork Dam, a 72-foot tall earthen embankment holding back an artificial lake 2 miles long and containing roughly 20 million tons of water, ceased to exist. The entire reservoir emptied in approximately 45 minutes. The water hit Johnstown in a wave estimated between 35 and 40 feet high, traveling at speeds recorded between 40 and 60 miles per hour. 2,209 people were dead before sundown. But the water was not the villain in this story. The water was only the weapon. The villain had a name. Multiple names, in fact. Names that appeared in the society pages of Pittsburgh newspapers. Names that were engraved on the doors of private clubs and on the cornerstones of libraries. Names that, in the end, faced absolutely no legal consequence whatsoever. This is not simply the story of a flood. This is the story of what happens when private wealth is allowed to hold a city's fate above its head, and what happens when that grip finally slips. The Conemaugh Valley in western Pennsylvania was not an obvious place to build a city. Geographically, it was almost a trap. Johnstown sat at the confluence of the Stony Creek and the Little Conemaugh River, ringed on 3 sides by steep wooded hills that rose sharply above the valley floor. When water fell in the mountains above the city, it had nowhere to go but straight down, straight into the narrow channel that ran through the heart of Johnstown's industrial district. The city had flooded before. Small floods, manageable floods. The kind that put an inch of muddy water in the basement, that ruined a season's worth of stored goods, that sent the residents grumbling up the hillsides for an afternoon before returning home with mops and resignation. Flooding was simply a feature of life in Johnstown, the same way coal dust was a feature, the same way the smell of the Cambria Iron Works, Pennsylvania's most productive steel mill, hung permanently over the valley like a second sky. The residents of Johnstown were not naive people. They were steel workers and miners and shopkeepers and immigrant laborers who had come from Wales, from Ireland, from Germany, from Hungary, building their lives in a valley that the geography had never fully endorsed. They were accustomed to hardship. They were not accustomed to catastrophe. 14 miles upstream, however, something else had been built. Something that would make the geography of the Conemaugh Valley not merely inconvenient, but fatal. The South Fork Dam had originally been constructed by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1853 as part of an early canal system, a water reservoir, to feed the Pennsylvania Mainline Canal. By 1879, after years of neglect and disuse, it had been purchased for a remarkably small sum by a Pittsburgh iron and railroad magnate named Benjamin Ruff. Ruff did not buy it for water management. He did not buy it for the people living downstream. He bought it for leisure. Within 2 years, the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club had been established on the shores of the artificial lake. The dam contained a lake, now renamed Lake Conemaugh. The membership roster reads like a directory of the Gilded Age's most powerful American industrialists. Andrew Carnegie, the steel baron. Henry Clay Frick, Carnegie's business partner, and the man who would become one of the most feared figures in American labor history, Andrew Mellon, the banking patriarch. Robert Garrett, president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Roughly 60 families in total, each paying membership fees that would be equivalent today to tens of thousands of dollars annually for the privilege of building private cottages on the shore of a lake held in place by a dam that had already begun to fail. The modifications the club made to the dam between 1879 and 1889 were not subtle. They were structural, they were documented, and they were catastrophic in their engineering. The original dam's iron discharge pipes, the critical safety mechanism that allowed operators to lower the lake's water level in advance of heavy rainfall, had been removed and sold for scrap metal, reportedly to recover some of the club's initial investment costs. The broad spillway on the western end of the dam, which had been specifically engineered to provide emergency overflow capacity, was narrowed. A fish screen was placed across it not for safety reasons, but to prevent the club's expensive stocked fish from escaping into the river downstream. The screen collected debris. The screen reduced flow, and the road that ran across the top of the dam had been lowered slightly in its center to allow carriage traffic, which inadvertently reduced the dam's crest height by as much as 2 feet at its most critical point. Local engineers noticed. Local residents noticed. For more than a decade before the flood, warnings had been circulating through the Conemaugh Valley with a persistence that, in retrospect, is almost unbearable to read. The chief engineer of a Pittsburgh engineering firm had inspected the dam in the 1880s and submitted a written report describing its condition as dangerously inadequate. A Johnstown newspaper had run an editorial in 1880 directly addressing the risk the dam posed to the city below. Multiple letters were written, multiple concerns were raised, and every single one of them was met with the same response from the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club: silence, dismissal, or the quiet assurance that the dam was perfectly sound. The club members rarely came to the lake before Memorial Day. The workers, the steel workers, the families in the valley below, they lived beneath it year-round. In the final week of May 1889, a slow-moving weather system that meteorologists would later classify as the remnant of a Gulf of Mexico cyclone stalled over the Allegheny Mountains of western Pennsylvania and began to drop rain. Not ordinary rain, the kind of rain that overwhelmed every instrument designed to measure it. On May 30th and into May 31st, rainfall totals in the mountains above Johnstown ranged from 6 to 8 inches in approximately 24 hours. The soil was already saturated from earlier spring rains. The runoff was total. Every tributary feeding Lake Conemaugh ran at maximum capacity. The lake level rose by a foot, then 2 feet, then more. At the South Fork Dam, the club's caretaker, a man named John Parquet, a young civil engineering graduate who had arrived at the lake only the previous autumn, watched the water rise with growing alarm through the early hours of May 31st. There were no discharge pipes. There was no way to lower the lake level. The only mechanism available was the screened spillway, which was already running at full capacity and was partially blocked by debris accumulating against the fish screen. Parquet and a small crew of workers spent the morning hours trying to dig a secondary emergency channel around the west end of the dam. They did not have the equipment or the time. The secondary channel barely scratched the surface of the hillside. At approximately 11:30 inches the morning, John Park rode his horse at full speed to the South Fork Telegraph Station and sent a warning down the line to Johnstown. The warning was received. It was not the first such warning that had come over those wires during floods. The operators in Johnstown passed the message along through the system, but no general evacuation order was issued. No emergency sirens were activated. The residents of Johnstown had heard warnings before. They had not been killed before. They thought they knew what a flood looked like. They did not know what this looked like. At 3:10 p.m. on the 31st of May 1889, the center section of the South Fork Dam gave way. Not gradually, not slowly, with time to reconsider. The breach was catastrophic and nearly instantaneous. A section roughly 300 feet wide collapsed, and in that moment, Lake Conemaugh, 2 miles long, 1 mile wide, 60 feet deep in places, became a river moving at 40 miles per hour. A river carrying not just water, but the physical debris of everything the valley above had contained: trees, boulders, barbed wire from farm fences, the wreckage of lakeside cottages, locomotives from a repair yard. The wave consumed in the first seconds of its descent. The wave scoured the valley walls clean as it moved, gathering mass, gathering velocity, compressing into the narrowing gorge of the Little Conemaugh River with the efficiency of a hydraulic ram. It reached the small borough of South Fork, 2 miles below the dam, in minutes. South Fork was partially destroyed. Some residents managed to reach higher ground. The wave did not stop to take account of what it had done. It reached Mineral Point. It reached East Conemaugh, where a railroad yard containing dozens of locomotives and hundreds of freight cars was simply seized by the water and incorporated into its mass. 5 zero-ton engines spinning and tumbling in a wave of brown churning destruction. A locomotive engineer named John Hess saw the wave coming and opened his throttle to maximum, blowing his whistle in a continuous alarm blast as he drove his engine ahead of the flood toward Johnstown. He managed to stay ahead of the water long enough to give a few minutes of warning to the communities along the track. The sound of his whistle was the only warning most of those people received. The wave reached Woodvale, a company town of approximately 1,000 people built immediately upstream of Johnstown by the Cambria Iron Company. Woodvale was nearly obliterated. 3/4 of its residents died in the first minutes of impact. And then, at 3:10 inches the afternoon, though some survivor accounts place it closer to 4:07, due to the time the flood required to travel the 14 miles from the dam, the wave struck Johnstown itself. It arrived not from one direction, but from multiple directions simultaneously, because the geography of the valley, the same geography that had always made Johnstown feel hemmed in and enclosed, now acted as a funnel, channeling the flood into the city from every angle at once. The wave that struck the center of Johnstown has been estimated at between 35 and 40 feet in height at the point of impact. It was carrying, by the time it reached the city, an estimated 20 million tons of water and debris, combined a moving mass that demolished everything in its path, with a force that structural engineers, examining the wreckage afterward, struggled to find language adequate to describe. A survivor named Victor Heiser, who was 16 years old on the day of the flood, later described watching the wave arrive from the roof of his family's barn. He described the noise as resembling nothing he had ever heard before or after, not like rushing water, not like wind, but like a roar composed of every sound at once, the sound of a city being destroyed and compressed into a single advancing front. He watched the wave take his parents. He survived by leaping between rooftops as the water swirled beneath him, catching at his feet, rising and receding, and rising again. In her final notation before the Western Union lines went dead, a telegraph operator at the Johnstown station simply logged the time, 3:10 p.m., and wrote that the wires had failed. She survived by climbing to the upper floor of the office building. Her notation was the last official communication out of Johnstown before the city went dark. A railroad dispatcher named Robert Pitcairn, who had received John Park's warning earlier in the day, later described the moment he realized the magnitude of the event when communications from Johnstown simply ceased entirely, every wire going silent at the same moment, as though the city had been switched off like a lamp. The water spent approximately 10 minutes destroying Johnstown. 10 minutes to flatten the lower portions of the city, to carry houses off their foundations and stack them against the old stone railroad bridge at the lower end of the valley, and to kill 2,209 people, a number that took weeks of searching, identification, and counting to arrive at. More than 1,600 of those victims were never identified at all. They were buried in a mass grave that still exists. The thought the worst was over, but the true nightmare had only just begun. After the initial wave passed, the water in the valley did not simply recede, it pooled. Johnstown sat in a natural bowl, and the water that had just destroyed it had nowhere immediate to go. The city sat underwater for varying depths for days. But there was a second horror, a slower horror, building in the hours after the initial impact. At the Pennsylvania Railroad's Stone Arch Bridge, at the lower end of Johnstown, the debris carried by the flood, the houses, the trees, the locomotives, the barbed wire, the furniture, the bodies had accumulated into a massive logjam against the bridge's arches. The logjam was reportedly 30 feet high in places, stretching across the full width of the river and extending hundreds of feet upstream. Tens of thousands of tons of compressed debris formed a dam of its own. And then it caught fire. No one ever conclusively identified the source of ignition. a displaced stove, a ruptured oil tank from one of the rail yard's storage facilities, a lamp. The debris jam, saturated and compressed, began to burn at approximately 6 p.m. on the evening of the flood, and it burned through the night and into the following day. Approximately 80 people were trapped alive in the debris jam when it ignited. Some managed to be pulled free by rescuers working at the margins. Some did not. The fire burned for 3 days. The survivors of Johnstown spent the night of May 31st on the hillsides above the valley, in whatever structure remained standing above the waterline, in attics, on rooftops, in the darkness, and the rain that continued to fall. They had no food, no dry clothing, no communication with the outside world. The only light came from the fire at the bridge. The first outside help did not reach Johnstown until the morning of June 1st, when railroad crews managed to clear enough track to get a train into the valley. What the relief workers on that train found when they arrived was described by nearly every account as a landscape that had ceased to resemble a city at all. Entire streets had vanished. The grid of the city, the street plan, the addresses, none of it existed anymore in the lower districts. The Cambria Ironworks, the industrial heart of the community, had survived with significant damage to its infrastructure, but was structurally intact. Its rolling mills and blast furnaces, built to withstand industrial violence, had fared better than the homes of the men who operated them. Clara Barton arrived in Johnstown on the 5th of June, 1889, leading the American Red Cross in what would become one of the organization's first major disaster relief operations in American history. She was 67 years old. She stayed for 5 months. Under her direction, the Red Cross established warehouses, coordinated incoming donations from across the country and from foreign governments, and managed the distribution of supplies to a displaced population of nearly 30,000 people. The public response to the Johnstown flood was enormous. Donations arrived from every state in the nation and from countries including France, Germany, and Great Britain. The total relief fund raised approached $3.7 million in 1889 dollars, an extraordinary sum that would be equivalent to well over $100 million in current value. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club contributed $3,000. Andrew Carnegie, whose personal fortune in 1889 was estimated at approximately $30 million, and who would go on to donate more than $350 million to philanthropic causes before his death, donated a library to Johnstown. He did not donate to the Flood Relief Fund in any sum proportionate to his wealth or his connection to the institution whose dam had just killed 2,209 of his countrymen. Henry Clay Frick, who served as the South Fork Club's primary real estate coordinator and whose cottage on Lake Conemaugh was among the most elaborate on the shore, donated $5,000 to relief efforts. The legal aftermath of the Johnstown flood was, in its own way, as devastating as the flood itself. Flood survivors and the families of victims pursued civil litigation against the members of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club for years following the disaster. Every case failed. Pennsylvania courts of the era applied a legal doctrine that classified the dam's failure as an act of God, a natural disaster beyond the reasonable foresight or control of the dam's owners. The plaintiff's attorneys argued that the modifications to the dam had been negligent, that the removal of the discharge pipes was actionable, that the documented warnings over more than a decade established foreknowledge of the risk. The courts found otherwise. Not a single member of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was ever held legally responsible for the deaths of 2,209 people. The doctrine of act of God, which had been developed primarily in the context of genuinely unforeseeable natural events, was applied here to protect men who had been warned, repeatedly and in writing, that their dam was dangerous, men who had removed the safety mechanisms, men who had prioritized the retention of their fish stock over the installation of adequate overflow capacity, men whose modifications to a 70-foot earthen wall holding 20 million tons of water above a city of 30,000 people had been documented and transmitted to engineering authorities and ignored. In the immediate aftermath of the flood, the newspapers were not gentle. The editorial pages of major American publications, even those generally sympathetic to the industrial class, noted the obvious connection between the club's modifications and the dam's failure. The Pittsburgh Dispatch, the New York Times, and papers across the country ran coverage that explicitly named the South Fork Club and its members as responsible parties. The public anger was genuine and widespread. For a time, it appeared that accountability might be possible. But the legal system of 1,889 was not engineered for accountability of this kind. And the men who owned the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club were among the same men who owned the railroads that carried goods to market, the banks that extended credit to newspapers, the steel mills that employed the legislators. The architecture of American industrial power in the Gilded Age was not designed with mechanisms for holding itself responsible. The years passed. The city was rebuilt. The legal cases were dropped or dismissed. Carnegie built his library. Frick went on to crush a steelworkers' strike at Homestead 3 years later, in 1892, in an event that left 10 people dead and became one of the most notorious labor confrontations in American history. Andrew Mellon went on to become Secretary of the Treasury. Andrew Carnegie died one of the most celebrated philanthropists in the English-speaking world. Johnstown rebuilt itself. It took years. The physical reconstruction of the city's infrastructure required entirely new engineering surveys because so much of the original street grid had been obliterated. The population, which had been 30,000 before the flood, took nearly 2 decades to recover to pre-flood numbers. The psychological damage, the thing that no engineering survey could measure, persisted far longer. There is a category of grief that does not have a clean name. It is the grief that comes not just from loss, but from the knowledge that the loss was preventable, that specific decisions made by specific people in specific rooms, decisions made for reasons of cost and convenience, and the preservation of recreational fishing, led directly to the deaths of children and workers and shopkeepers and immigrants who never had any say in those decisions and whose names were not engraved on any club's membership roster. More than 750 of the flood's victims were children. 99 entire families were wiped out, no surviving member of any kind. The bodies of some victims were recovered as far away as Cincinnati, carried there by the river system over the weeks following the flood. The last identified body from the Johnstown Flood was recovered in 1911, 22 years after the disaster. The South Fork Dam site still exists in western Pennsylvania, preserved as part of the Johnstown Flood National Memorial, administered by the National Park Service. The outline of the former lake bed is still visible in the landscape. A broad, flat depression where the valley widens, filled now with trees and grass, where the water once sat waiting. The old spillway channel is still there. The site of the dam's breach is marked. Visitors walk along the crest line of where the earthen wall once stood and look down into the valley below. 14 miles away, Johnstown still exists. It is smaller now than it was in 1889. The broader decline of the American steel industry through the latter half of the 20th century took care of that, but it persists. The stone arch railroad bridge that trapped the debris and held while everything around it failed is still standing. The people who visit Johnstown today can stand on that bridge and look upstream at a valley that no longer carries any visible trace of what happened there on the 31st of May, 1889. That is, perhaps, the most unsettling thing of all. Not the scale of the destruction, which was enormous. Not the failure of justice, which was total. But the erasure. The way that a landscape heals. The way that new streets are built over the foundations of destroyed ones. The way that decades of ordinary life accumulate over a catastrophe until the catastrophe begins to feel like a historical footnote rather than a crime. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was dissolved shortly after the flood. Its members dispersed back into the fabric of American industrial society, into their board positions and their bank presidencies and their entries in the history books, as captains of industry, as builders of America, as men whose names were placed on the facades of museums and universities and concert halls. The 2,209 people they killed have no facades. They have a number. They have a park. They have the memory of that low-ground vibration that came up through the soles of their shoes one afternoon in late May, the hum that had no name, the sound that arrived before the sound. And they have this, the knowledge now that the history was not what they were told it was. that the act of God had a membership list, that the natural disaster had a deed of sale, that the wave that erased a city in 10 minutes had been building, quietly, legally, in full view of every institution designed to prevent it for a decade and a half before it arrived. The water is gone, the lake is gone, the dam is gone, but the question it left behind has never been fully answered. When private wealth builds a wall above a city of working people, and the wall is known to be dangerous, and the wall falls, who is responsible? In 1889, America answered that question one way. The question has not stopped being asked.